Luther. And that's a big thing because Luther is a big figure in the story. And one where, again, I would bet my mortgage that at least a short answer or an essay or a series of multiple choice questions will have something to do with Luther. Okay. So Luther's primary concern as a young man and then growing up, what was it for the seniors that were here yesterday? How to get to heaven. And what he was told wasn't sufficient for him. Because the two things that you needed according to Catholic theology in order to be saved were faith, but no, not yet points. We didn't get to that part yet. Good works. All right. And then amongst those good works, that's the part where, am I doing enough as a human being to offset my sins to get to a place where I am worthy of entering heaven? And thinking that God was, God's so big and so powerful and so wonderful that anything that I could possibly do isn't going to satisfy God. All right. And then he gets to the point where he starts reading the letters of St. Paul. And then it comes clear to him that it's God's righteousness that gives grace amongst the faithful. Don't worry about the good works. The good works are fine, but that's not how you're going to get there. Okay. And then worse than that, it was how the good works component had gotten manipulated through the course of time to the point where we meet Archbishop Albrecht and we meet Pope Leo X and we meet the Fuggers and we meet this scheme in which they're trying. I mean, we're looking at, like, if you have a bingo card, they've pretty much X'd out every single one of the things that kind of highlights church corruption. You had pluralism, you had simony, and now you've got the sale of indulgences, and it's all in the same story. And Luther happens to be preaching at Wittenberg, which is a neighboring town to Magdeburg, which was one of the archbishoprics that Albert had purchased from the Fuggers. So he's going to sell indulgences to raise the revenues to pay that person back. Zach.
Did everyone have access to a Bible at this point, or still
no? God, no.
So,
but they're I mean,
how did he get access to the St. Paul?
I'm sorry.
He got access to the St.
Well,
Paul.
he did. I mean, he's a monastic, right? So he's going to be able to read. All right, he did know Latin. His Greek was terrible, but he did know Latin. Like, Luther was a very well-educated man. All right, remember that he had a master's degree and a bachelor's degree and was working on law school when he got almost hit by lightning or got caught in a thunderstorm and said, I'm going to become an Augustinian friar. But if you're in a monastery, you got access to the Bible. Okay. And he had access to a really, really good teacher. His name was John Staupitz. And Staupitz is the one that kind of turned him on to the letters of St. Paul. So, I mean, yeah, Joe Schmo is not yet reading the Bible for themselves. But after Luther's Reformation, that's one of the big impacts or social impacts of the Reformation, is that people should read the Bible for themselves. Okay. Not only that, but they start putting together what they call catechisms. Anybody in may have grown up in church and had to attend catechism. Catechism is like school to learn what the church stands for or to learn what you believe. So when they have different parts of the Bible, or if you say certain prayers, this is what those prayers mean. And they all started to work on these catechisms where they could actually explain, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And this is what this means, and this is what this means. Nobody was providing any of that information. Remember, the vehicle that I gave you guys the other day it's the blind leading the blind. That Peter Bruegel, I'll say Bruegel, and we'll just leave it at the fact that I cannot pronounce it correctly. But the guy that painted the peasants and the different scenes of the peasants, I told you the one that I liked was the blind leading the blind, because I thought it was a pretty good allegory on what was going on. And Luther and some of those folks are going to correct it. This is the last thing that we were working on, this slide, where we were trying to highlight out Luther's theology. So let's just quickly go over that again. Ben, in response to the first question about how is a person to be saved, what? Does that just rent? How is a person saved? If you're the Catholic Church, you say that's a very small component of a larger theological position. Faith and good works. Okay. And then for Luther, justification by faith. Okay. Second one, religious authority. The church says that religious authority resides in the church. What does Luther say? Sola scriptura, meaning the scripture is the sole authority. If it's in the Bible, yeah, okay. If it's not, the church probably manipulated it so that they could give themselves more power. The third one, and this is the most controversial, what is the church? For the church, what is the church? Yeah, it's an organization. It's all of the things. It's the Vatican. It's the episcopacy. It's the different hierarchies and the bishops and the archbishops and the abbots and the cardinals and the popes and the treasury department and the legal department. It's freaking Amazon. Okay. What is the church according to Luther? A community of believers. Okay. And then if you buy that argument, Luther is still, and yesterday I kind of like smart-assed around this a little bit about, Jesus talking to St. Peter and then, on this rock you will build my church. And remember with the architectural plans and that sort of thing. You guys remember that from yesterday? Okay. So absent that, Luther is a revolutionary in the sense that a lot of the things that the church had now kind of created over the course of time to define itself as a church, as a body, as a thing, okay? A lot of that stuff is completely unnecessary now. All right. And that also means things like the papacy and all of the other hierarchies and everything else that kind of could go away with it. All right. There is no need for the papacy. There is no need for the Vatican. And we're going to get into some of the, like, how is he able to get away with this kind of stuff today? The highest form of Christian life. And yesterday somebody mentioned that, if he gets married, how does he claim himself to be like a religious figure? That was part of it. Was in a recognition that clerical celibacy was another one of those things that had no real scriptural basis and didn't really even make logical sense according to the idea that God created man and woman. So again, the highest form of Christian life is equal merit in all vocations. Yes, sir.
So would every denomination of Christianity that's not Catholic be considered Protestant or other?
Not necessarily, but that's what the term itself is kind of loosely applied. And we mentioned that I'll talk more about it today. But it wasn't just Luther that was kind of rejecting a lot of saying the things and rejecting the things that he was. There's a movement that's going on concurrently in Switzerland that we're going to talk about on Monday or Tuesday or whenever we meet again. And so you have all these theologians that are kind of doing Lutheran sort of things in their various places, and they want to come together so that at least they could have one common idea that they could use as a counterweight to the Roman Catholic Church. Right? All the church people are trying to get their story straight so that if they present it to the Roman Catholic Church, that they'll have better luck. All right. And that's where, like, Protestant is just a term.
Okay, so it's not like Catholic.
No, they made it up at a German assembly in 1529. They just kind of gave a name to what they all were. But yeah, if there would have been like some kind of agreement, and I'm going to talk about this today, it's called the Marburg Colloquy. Actually, I'm going to talk about it on Monday too, or Tuesday. But if the Marburg Colloquy had been successful in getting all of these reformers together, then maybe we don't have a Lutheran church, or we don't have a Calvinist church, or we don't have all of the different sects that fall under a larger umbrella called Protestant. Okay. All right. I talked a little bit about this. I'm going to kind of go through these. This is what's aggravating about Luther, is that he didn't really put everything in one document. So when you hear like the 95 Theses, that is very specific to the sale of indulgences and the scriptural basis for that. Like, he didn't plan to have some gigantic revolution at that moment. He was like, I'm having a hard time with this sale of indulgences thing. Let's talk about it. That's really what 95 Theses was about. Okay. This one called On Christian Liberty, if you ever see this like as a document or anything else, I'm going to talk about why this one is important later. But the biggest reason why is because of this phrase where he says, a Christian man is the most free Lord of all and subject to none. Okay. If you can remember that, because there's going to be a bunch of social movements that happen where the German peasants are going to rise up and revolt, and they're using Lutheran language as the basis for their revolt. So the On Christian Liberty is part of the reason why. And he's talking about religious liberty, okay? That you are kind of free in your relationship with God. You're not tied again to the middleman, and I keep referring to the Catholic Church as a middleman because that's what they become. They become an intermediary between you and God. Okay, this one is called an address to the Christian nobility of the German nation. I told you yesterday, why did they not burn Luther? Yeah, because of the German princes, in particular because of Frederick of Wise, or Frederick of Saxony, Frederick the Wise of Saxony, who was one of the 7 most powerful German princes. It's part of a group called the Electors. All right, I'll get to that and like where that was created in the first place. And because the emperor is really emperor in name only, and that the real power is held by those German princes. Okay, but that Habsburg emperor wants to keep all of his titles of all of his lands. The only one that's going to make them happen or make that happen for him is going to be the German princes. Okay, that puts Charles in a really tough spot because Charles is dependent on the German princes. Some of the German princes have adopted Luther's ideas, and some of them have not. Okay. The address to the Christian nobility is a recognition. This is the second kind of phrase, if you will, is that Luther knows where his bread is buttered. Okay. And what that means is Luther's got this design that says, I am going to reform the church. I am going to get rid of all of the baggage and all of the things that I've got problems with the papacy. Not just the corruption, but also basic theological objections to some of the things that they're doing. If we're going to get that done, though, I need the princes. I need their power. I recognize that they are going to support me and that they're the muscle behind my mind, if that makes sense. Okay. There's a phrase in this, though, called an address to the Christian nobility. Now, I'm going to read this part of it because it's kind of like paraphrased from Mackay. But which part of this, if you are a German prince, would you be the most excited about? It says, unless the princes destroyed papal power in Germany, Luther argued, reform was impossible. He urged the princes to confiscate ecclesiastical wealth, to abolish indulgences, dispensations, pardons, and clerical celibacy. He told them that it was their public duty to bring about the moral reform of the church. Luther based his argument in part on the papacy's financial exploitation of Germany. Now he's going to start kind of like punking them a little bit. He says, how comes it that we Germans must pay up with such how comes it that we Germans must put up with such robbery and such extortion of our property at the hands of the Pope? If the kingdom of France has prevented it, referring to the pragmatic sanction of Bourges and the Concordat of Bologna, why do we Germans let them make such fools and apes of us? It would be all the more bearable if in this way they only stole our property, but they lay waste the churches and rob Christ's sheep of their pious shepherds and destroy worship and the word of God. As it is, they do nothing for the good of Christendom. They only wrangle about the incomes of bishoprics and prelacies, and that any robber would do. Appeal to the Christian nobility of the German nation. Now, out of all of those things that I said about pardons and clerical celibacy and dispensations, if they were thinking and listening to this, what might make them Lutheran?
Well, he says that they should seize the wealth of the church.
Boom, done, game over. Yes. Unlike the West, and we talked about this yesterday, where the king is starting to use the middle class to reduce the power of the nobility, there is no such arrangement that exists in Central Europe. These states that make up the Holy Roman Empire it's not Germany. It's like 360 different little territories. And the people that control those territories are the princes. Right? So they don't really answer to anyone in their own jurisdiction, except that about 40% of all their wealth, 40% of all the property under their jurisdiction is controlled by the church. So if you have a guy that comes along and says they're corrupt, they shouldn't be doing this in the first place, and not only that, but let me make fun of you because the French don't let this happen, but you guys will. Now, if you're the German princes, you're going to be like, hell yeah, I'm Lutheran. And that's the point. He needs them, but now they're kind of like, if we're Lutheran, doesn't that mean that 40% doesn't go to the Vatican? It stays here? They're like, sign me up. Where's the Lutheran contract? I'm in. And you're going to have a handful of Lutheran princes that are going to pop up. And part of it is, A, they may come from areas where anti-clericalism was kind of smack dab in their face. Okay. Not everyone's going to do it because there are people that were concerned that what they're doing is heresy, and that they're not necessarily in it for the money, which is weird, but true. Okay. The last two that you see there, come on, where it says an admonition to peace and against the thievish, murderous hordes of peasants are also works of Martin Luther. Okay. And they have to do with the German peasants' revolt, and we haven't talked about it yet, so we'll save those. But Luther, when I said Luther knows where his bread is buttered, and he sees the princes as being the ticket to his ability to reform the church in Germany, what if the peasants are rising up against those very princes? What side does Luther take? He's going to side with the princes, which makes him a hypocrite. It makes him very, very contradictory in what he's going to say. All right. But he's like almost like Machiavellian in a way, like whatever is necessary, but I need to reform the church. And sadly, a lot of the German princes, they look to Luther as being their champion. Like they were using his writings as a means to rise up and revolt against their secular lords. Typical peasants' revolt. We pay all these taxes. We've got all these labor obligations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to look at the document that they used as a basis for their uprising. This one called the Confession of Augsburg is the closest thing that you will find to a organized Lutheran theology. And it doesn't happen until 1530. And it happens because he finally found somebody that could teach him Greek. His name was Philip Melanchthon. So Philip Melanchthon is kind of the scholar beyond Luther. Luther is pretty damn good, but Melanchthon was kind of on a different level. The Confession of Augsburg is in 1530. And then those catechisms that I was telling you about, like once the Lutheran Church is created, they're going to vernacularize the Bible. That's one of the things that Luther does, is he creates a German translation of the Bible. Okay. And in those churches, they put catechisms together. They want people to get literate. They want people to read. They want people to understand why they're worshiping the way that they're worshiping. Okay. That's something that they'll do in Calvin's Geneva. That's something that they'll do in the Anabaptist faith. But it's an idea that we are going to create a literate public. And the reason why we're creating a literate public is we want people to read scripture for themselves. Okay. These three terms, which are kind of weird. Transubstantiation, these are like three big time Scrabble words. Transubstantiation, consubstantiation, and memorialism. They have to do with the Eucharist. What is the Eucharist? Yes, sir. The bread and wine. Okay. People that aren't Christian are like, what the hell are you talking about? Okay, so there's a point of Christian service towards the end. And in Catholic faith, it is like the focal point of the service, and it's based on Jesus's Last Supper. And so there's a point in the mass where the priest holds up the bread and said, take this. This is my body. That he's saying the words that Jesus had said to the 12 apostles before he got betrayed and crucified and all those things. It says, take this. This is my body. And in Catholic theology, the belief is that the priest is holding up that bread so that that bread is spiritually transformed from being just bread to the body of Christ. And then the same thing goes for the cup. Okay? That it's no longer just wine, it's the blood of Christ. But the Catholics, yet again, it's a middleman thing. You can't make that happen without the priest performing the ritual, where the bread and wine is transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Luther's is kind of a cop-out. He calls it inner presence and basically says, yeah, it's the body and the blood, but it's bread and wine, but it's also the body and blood. All he wanted to do was kind of say, yeah, I kind of like that part of the Mass or the church service. I believe in the Last Supper and all of those things, but I just don't think that the priestly blessing is like magically transforming it. So he comes up with it's called the doctrine of inner presence, or it's called consubstantiation. And then the rest of the Protestants are focusing on the other part that was said when you read this part of the Mass, and that is, take this is my body, drink this is my blood, and then they say, do this in memory of me. That's the part that they focused on. So that's called memorialism. And when they, at the end, I've gone to a few Protestant services and they pass out some grape juice and maybe some crackers or something like that, that it's part of just kind of like, I don't know, pouring out liquor. All right. Why do you pour out liquor? In memory of a homie. All right. So for Jesus, that's kind of what it is. It's sort of like a pour out some liquor for Jesus. But it's the bread and wine is just the bread and wine. It's not like it doesn't magically become the body and blood of Christ. Okay. And believe it or not, when I was talking about the Marburg colloquy earlier and saying all these different Protestants, instead of there being like the Catholics and then the Protestants ended up being like 50 different groups. The reason why is because they had a place where they were going to all come together to come up with one position statement on what their body of theology was going to be. And the meeting broke up because they couldn't get together on what the Eucharist meant. Luther's like consubstantiation. They're like pouring one out for the homies. This guy's like consubstantiation. And they broke up the meeting because they could not agree on what the nature of the Eucharist was. And that's why we have a Lutheran, Zwingli, Calvin, Anabaptists, and all these other groups that are going to pop up. Okay. All right. Did I talk about these then? Eliminate the middleman. Does everybody know what that is? It's a good way of explaining the theology. Most of what Luther was trying to do was take the church out of the way so that people could have a direct relationship with God. And that even like 4 of the 7 sacraments were not, and there was no scriptural basis for them. It's kind of like the church just needed to add them and make them sacraments so that they had a place that makes them indispensable, so that you need them if you're going to be able to get to heaven. All right. Did I talk about the 7 German electors? I think I mentioned Frederick of Saxony or Frederick the Wise. This goes back a little bit. Okay. And if you guys remember my map, where I just drew a bunch of distressed looking circles and said that's the Holy Roman Empire, it symbolizes decentralization. And it's not like Germany could have not been unified a lot earlier. It's that in the Middle Ages, the German emperors or the Holy Roman emperors were so concerned about the territories between Germany and France, including and especially Italy, that they never really spent the time to solidify their control over their own jurisdiction. So you go back and look at some really, really good emperors like Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II, the Salian emperors, and some of the Ottos. And you would have found that they would have been great and could have done what Henry II, Plantagenet was trying to do in England, or Philip II Augustus was trying to do in France, and that was to centralize his authority. But it's sort of like he would be like in the German states and get everything kind of organized and then be like, y'all good? And then he takes off for Italy. And then after a while, it had got to a point where the Holy Roman Emperor was in Sicily, like didn't even like live in the German states. And so what ultimately ended up happening was, as you found that the Holy Roman Emperor became more and more like an absentee landowner, more and more power and authority was surrendered to these local German nobles. Until ultimately we got to a point in 1356 where they kind of did their Magna Carta thing. All right. Now, it doesn't mean that there's like a parliament for all the German states. They would never go for that. But what they did go with, because that would at least incite some kind of centralization, what they did decide was they were going to take almost like 7 of the most dominant of the German princes and kind of create them as like a board of governors. And they called them the great electors. And if you were an elector, you were generally coming from a big place like Bavaria or Saxony or Brandenburg or someplace like that. That's who Frederick the Wise was. He was the elector of Saxony, and Saxony was one of the biggest territories in those German states that comprised the Holy Roman Empire. Okay? But it also symbolized that the nobles are the ones that had the power in the German states. And that, yes, you did have a Holy Roman Emperor who had jurisdiction over those territories, but their rule was nominal, which means really in name only. That if the Habsburgs had any power, and a lot of the Habsburgs ended up becoming elected as the Holy Roman Emperors, but those Habsburgs only had direct political control over a couple of little territories in the Holy Roman Empire, like Austria, all right, and a couple of others that we'll talk about that are close, like Styria and Tyrol. Okay. But that makes up like 7% of the landmass that makes up the Holy Roman Empire. Okay. So Luther is kind of lucky in the sense that he comes into a place where those local nobles have so much power. Because remember, what was the big meeting where he finally has to stand before Charles V? The Diet of Worms, right? And he's there, but he's got offensive linemen. Okay, he's got big offensive linemen, and they're in the form of those German princes. So Charles is looking at him, and Charles wants at him. Charles is like, "You're a heretic. You need to stop this stuff. The Pope told me that you burned an excommunication letter. You need to quit it." And Luther's like, "Unless I am convinced by Scripture that I am wrong, here I stand." And Charles is like, "Who do you think you're talking? I'm the emperor." But he can't, because the German princes, when Luther's talking, they're kind of like, "Yeah, confiscate ecclesiastical wealth." All right. And so Charles is like, "You're a bad man, you're a brigand, you're a firebrand, you're a rebel. Anybody that protects you is on my what list." Okay. But Frederick of Saxony's like, "Don't worry about it, man. He's just speaking loud. You're going to come, you're going to hang out in this castle. Things are going to be good for a couple of years. You can get married, you can write a little bit. And then when the coast is clear, you can come back out." And that's ultimately what happened. Because the German princes, he's telling them something that they want to hear: confiscate ecclesiastical wealth. They're telling him something that he wants to hear: we got your back. Okay. And that's what gives Luther, because John Wycliffe didn't have that. And we know that John Huss did not have that. But Luther does. He's able to take advantage of a very unique political situation in the German states for him to be able to preach what he needs to preach and then ultimately be successful. Okay. Charles V is a byproduct of the Habsburg marriage machine. Remember, we talked about that. Everybody wrote on the new monarch, so you're familiar with the fact that politically arranged marriages was part of the MO of Ferdinand and Isabella. One of their daughters ended up marrying the son of Maximilian Habsburg, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. Okay. And in that marriage, they ended up producing a son between Joanna of Castile, who was Ferdinand and Isabella's daughter, and Philip, Duke of Burgundy, who was the son of Maximilian Habsburg. His name is Charles. Charles V. Anybody know the Queen died yesterday? Okay, second longest reigning monarch in history. Okay, only 2 years away from King Louis XIV. Everybody knows that Prince Charles is going to become Charles III, right? He's the third king to be named Charles. The last one to be named Charles was back in the 1600s. So it's been a while since we've had a King Charles. I don't know why that matters, but I want to acknowledge that the Queen died yesterday. That's sad. But she was 96, so you got to give her some props. Okay. Okay. Here's how we need to describe this. Charles V, and we're going to look at his kingdom. In fact, if you look on this map, you see all those areas in purple? Not only that, but that red boundary is the boundary of the Holy Roman Empire, which means that he has that title. He's the Holy Roman Emperor, but he's also the King of Spain, which means that Charles has territory in, you can see a lot of territory in Italy. This specific territory near Austria, Styria, Carinthia, he's the Holy Roman Emperor. He controls the Netherlands. He controls a region called Franche-Comté. He controls Spain. He controls all of the kingdom that Spain had built, which means Central and South America. You know, the Aztecs and the Incas and all that territory that got conquered, that also belongs to him. Okay? All he had to do was be born, and he becomes one of the largest landowners in European history. Okay? Doesn't that sound wonderful? He's the King of Spain and he's the Holy Roman Emperor. But he had so many headaches with being able to try to control and maintain those possessions that he was about to lose his mind. Okay, and that's what I wanted to refer to back there. He had wars against the Valois kings. Remember I talked about that? That the sack of Italy, when France sacked Italy in 1494, it ended up becoming part of a larger war between the Holy Roman Empire and France, and the battlegrounds were Italy and then all of what we call Lothair's Middle Kingdom. So he's got a war against France. He also is encountering the highest point of Ottoman Empire power, and probably the greatest leader the Ottomans had, who was Suleiman the Magnificent. And Suleiman, as you can see how close the Ottoman Empire is to that boundary, there had been a fear that the Ottoman Empire was going to attack them directly. Okay? That he wanted to turn like Rome into a stable for his horses. So that is a much, much bigger threat, is that I'm going to need these German princes desperately if Ottoman Empire decides they're going to invade. Okay? If there's uprisings in Spain, like because of the Spanish kingdom, I got to worry about making sure that everything's going smooth in Central America. I got to worry about everything going smooth in Hispaniola and all of the West Indies. I got to worry about if everything's going smooth in South America. I got to wonder if everything's going good in Spain. He was a native of the Netherlands. His father was the Duke of Burgundy, but he spent most of his childhood in the Netherlands. All right, Charles V didn't know a lot about these local cultures, but he's kind of propelled into this Luther story, and that's like the fifth or sixth thing on his list. So when he goes to the Diet of Worms, he's got to keep in mind that the people that he's dealing with, he's not just dealing with some religious renegade. He's dealing with the German princes that support the religious renegade, and he desperately needs those German princes if he's going to be able to maintain this territory. That's a big part of this. Does everybody get that? This is a little family tree to kind of show you what that looks like. Okay, Bloody Mary, Philip II, those are his, that's his kids. Right? Ends up marrying Isabella of Portugal, probably a cousin. Has a brother. We'll talk about that later. But he is the son of Joanna the Mad, or Juana the Mad, and Philip Habsburg. Okay, who was the daughter or the son of Mary of Burgundy and Maximilian. and Ferdinand and Isabella. Okay, the political revolts. The first one you don't really have to know much about. It's just it was an uprising where the lower order of German nobles or the lower order of knights had fought because they wanted more privileges and they wanted more property. And what was significant about it is that some of the figures that were fighting on behalf of this Knights Revolt were people that were very close to Martin Luther theologically. In fact, when Luther was trying to fight in order to get his ideas out there in the early 20 or 15 late 15 teens and early 20s, Ulrich von Hutten was one of the people that supported him. Okay. And this other guy by the name of Franz von Sickingen. But ultimately, the lower order knights came into conflict with the German princes because the highest ranking German princes would have lost property, would have lost wealth if the Knights Revolt had succeeded. So again, Luther is put into a situation. Do I support my buddies who I agree with theologically, or do I support the German princes? And he backs off and he lets whatever's going to happen to the knights happen. A lot of those leading knights revolters ended up getting murdered or ended up getting jailed, and the Knights Revolt was beat back. Okay. This one's a lot bigger. The German Peasants' Revolt. Because in areas all over the German states, but particularly in some of these southern German states like Swabia, Thuringia, Saxony, areas near the Swiss border, which makes sense because there's a lot of people that are rising up and revolting around the Swiss border. Okay. The German peasants are going to rise up and revolt. And if you listen at what they're saying, it's very clear that they've gotten Martin Luther's message, particularly that one that I gave you from On Christian Liberty. A Christian man is the most free Lord of all and subject to none. But a lot of these German peasants are enserfed and they've got to pay all kinds of crazy taxes and they have all kinds of labor obligations and they're serfs, which means that they're tied to the land. I mean, in Europe, a serf is a slave. Okay. It's hereditary. They have no escape from it. Okay. If you're a free peasant, at least you have some freedom of movement, but not these folks. So there's a lot that was bugging them. Yeah, that's not good. Let me go to the. Hang on just a second. I have a copy of the 12 articles somewhere. Give me 1 second. It's in miscellaneous. Miscellaneous. It was in the reading, the Kagan reading, if you guys had done it. It's just a little excerpt that some people could do as a pub PSD if you wanted to. All right, let me just get to the right one here, and then I can blow it up. There it is. I guess I gotta open it that way. That's fun. Come on. Why isn't that working? Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, it's called German Peasants Protest Rising Feudal Exactions. And if you look at some of the points on here, it's called the 12 Articles. There's a lot of articles in this unit. All right, but the 12 Articles is written by the German peasants as a petition for why they need to get some of these things changed that are putting an unnecessary burden on their lives. But if you look at what kind of language they use, like for instance, this is number 3. We take it for granted that you will release us from serfdom as true Christians unless it be shown us from the gospel that we are serfs. Who's inspiring that? Luther, of course. Remember the whole sola scriptura? So they've got all these taxes and titles and labor obligations and things like that. And they're saying, if there's a scriptural basis for us having to pay this or having to do this or obligating to us to this, we'll do it. But if not, you need to free us. You need to get rid of these unnecessary taxes. Okay. This one, we will entirely abolish the due called todfall, that is, the death tax by which the Lord received the best horse, cow, or garment of a family upon the death of a serf. So instead of the family grieving the fact that they had lost a fellow serf, they have to pay like some kind of duty to the Lord because they lost a worker. Okay. And they were like, we shouldn't have to do that. We should just be able to grieve. And they're like, yeah, but we need a horse or something in compensation. Okay. So this sort of thing, it's not saying that like they're just wildly ravaging the countryside and setting fire to everybody. Yeah, they might have done a little of that too. But there is a method to their madness here, and it's based on the fact that Martin Luther is giving them a prescription for why they would rise up and revolt in the first place. How does Luther fall on that story? What is Luther's response? He supports the princes. Okay. There's two other works that I referred to when we were looking at this section. One was called An Admonition to Peace. All right. And the other was called Against the Thievish, Murderous Hordes of Peasants. Okay. So when he first started out, he kind of said to the Lords, this makes sense. What they're doing kind of makes a little bit of sense. He says, we have no one on earth to thank for this mischievous rebellion except you lords and princes, especially you blind bishops and mad priests and monks. In your government, you do nothing but flay and rob your subjects in order that you may lead a life of splendor and pride until the poor common folk can take it no longer. Seems to be like he kind of understands why they're doing what they're doing, and then kind of catches himself and realizes that the bigger production for him is to try to make sure that the Reformation is successful in Germany and that they can cast aside like all the things that are related to the Catholic Church. So he needs those German princes. Remember, Luther knows where his bread is buttered. That's why he writes, which is probably the most hypocritical document ever created, called the Against the Thievish, Murderous Hordes of Peasants. Now listen to this part. It says massive revolts first broke out near the Swiss frontier, swept into Swabia, Thuringia, the Rhineland, Saxony. The crowd slogans came directly from Luther's writings. God's righteousness, the word of God, were invoked in an effort to secure social and economic justice. The peasants who expected Luther's support were soon disillusioned. He had written of freedom of the Christian, but he meant the freedom to obey the word of God and for in men and women lose their freedom and break their relationship with God. Freedom for Luther meant independence from the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. It did not mean opposition to legally established secular powers. Didn't the Roman Catholic Church kind of make themselves a legally established secular power? All right, let's listen to this logic. Okay. He says to the peasants, let anyone who can smite, slay, or stab the peasants secretly and openly, remembering that nothing can be more poisonous, hurtful, or devilish than a rebel. It's like, who the hell do you think you are, Luther? Is he not the ultimate rebel? The guy that was standing up to the emperor, the guy that burned the excommunication letter? But now he's saying there's nothing worse than a rebel. Pot and cattle kind of stuff, yeah? Then he takes the letters of St. Paul, just for for kicks. Listen to this one. Let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are established by God. Whosoever resists the power resists the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. So he's now using the letters of St. Paul to explain why, if there are powers that exist in the world, God has put those powers in that place. What do you think about the Roman Catholic Church? Could they consider themselves a powers that be that are established by God? He's ignoring a lot in order to make this happen. And as a result, 75,000 people die. Oops. This kind of shows you where some of the revolts were taking place. All right, last bit then. So we know that he kind of pooped the bed, if you will, on the German peasants' revolt. Did the German princes actually get what they were seeking? Remember the whole, and this is a good way to kind of remember it, that in the 1520s, they spent the whole decade where theologians were the ones that dominated the plan for the German people or the German people to be able to adopt Lutheranism or some other faith as a counter to Christian theology and a counter to the power of the Catholic Church. They wanted to come up with a position statement that they could give to the church and say, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And hoping that the church was going to be like, bet. But it didn't happen. So in the 1530s, what had started out as German meetings among theologians to try to come up with some kind of apparatus that they could hand to the Catholic Church. And that's why they had the Diet of Speyer. And that's why they had the Confession of Augsburg and all of those things. After that, they were like, you know what? The hell with it. Let's just do it military style. Any of the German princes that want to adopt Lutheranism, we're going to put an army together. And we will take it out on the battlefield and let Charles know that we mean to be able to control religious jurisdiction in our areas. And if we want to be Protestant, we're going to be Protestant. If we want to stay Catholic, we're going to stay Catholic, but we are not going to be imposed upon by the emperor or the pope. And so that's called the Schmalkaldic League. And the wars are called the Schmalkaldic Wars. And at the very end here, it says, after 25 years of intermittent warfare between Lutheran and imperial forces, the Lutherans finally win some concessions. This is the first that we really seen of some major conflicts where Catholics and Protestants are battling it out. But I told you that Charles V was so overextended with the things that Charles had to do that the imperial forces, even though the imperial forces probably had better technology, they probably had better command, but the leaders of the Schmalkaldic League, like Philip, who was Margrave, which was a German noble title, of this region called Hesse, Hesse, that and Johann of Saxony was another one of those figures. But that military group eventually was going to succeed, and then they got concessions, and those concessions came in the Peace of Augsburg, which was written in 1555. What does it do? Anybody speak Latin? You speak a little Latin? What is that phrase at the bottom? What does it mean?
We don't do much in Latin.
Cuius regio eius religio.
Something king. Something.
Whose realm their religion?
Yeah. Whose realm their religion? Meaning that the prince in one of those 360 different places that we talked about ultimately dictates the religion of their jurisdiction. So if it's Saxony, and we know that the Saxons were supporting the Schmalkaldic League, that after the Peace of Augsburg, Saxony is a Lutheran state. Okay? Or Hesse, or some of these other areas, or Brandenburg. Remember the Hohenzollerns. They're going to be Lutheran. Okay? This is part one of a much bigger conflict that's going to come down the pipe. All right. But in the 1550s, they were at least, and this is a moment in time because there is no return on this. Okay. Catholic unity in Europe is done. Okay. This is the first document that pretty much says you can worship something else. And you have every legal right to do so. All right. There's the Holy Roman Empire. You can see there's going to be a lot of different faiths throughout Europe. All those little colors represent different things. But you see these areas in purple here, in pink? Those are going to be Lutheran states. Mostly it's going to be in places like the northern portion of the German states, but then also Scandinavia. Sweden, Denmark, Norway, they're all going to adopt Lutheranism. Yeah, you can go to the bathroom. We're done for today, by the way. Okay. Let me go over the stuff for Monday so that we know what we're doing. Okay. In the reading for Monday, there is a section called the Reformation Elsewhere. And it starts on page 391 of that Kagan reading, which I told you we're kind of abandoning McKay on this chapter. We're going to be using the two Kagan chapters instead. So the Kagan reading is called The Reformation Elsewhere, and we're going to be looking at, primarily we're going to be looking at the Swiss Reformation, because in the Swiss Reformation, we're going to meet Zwingli, and we're going to meet this really big heavyweight named John Calvin. Okay. And then we're going to look at this group called the Anabaptists. And then starting, and then later in the week, we're going to do England and Henry and all of those folks. And then we're going to start getting into some really big religious wars by the end of it. All right. So, any questions so far? And if you weren't here yesterday, then obviously there's some things to take a look at. But most of this is political. Does everybody kind of understand why Luther is kind of fortunate to be in the situation that he was in? But also recognize that Luther, he did dirty to some people that really, really needed him to lead them. But what choice do you make in the German peasants' revolt? Because if he supports them and says righteously, we need to take care of these guys, he loses the support of the German princes. He loses support of the German princes. He's no longer protected. Okay. And some people are like, why was he so insistent on reforming Germany? Anybody have any speculations of why he would do this? I mean, he turned his back on some close friends. He turned his back on the German peasants. Okay. He stood, kind of like bravely, in the early days, somebody could have gotten to him. They easily could have gotten to him. All right. Why was it so important for Luther to try to get this stuff done? Yes.
What he believed would get him into heaven.
Okay.
Would be the pious thing.
Bigger than that, though, because this is a thing that a lot of people in this time and place believed in very, very strongly, I guess is the term. He believed that the world was coming to an end. He was apocalyptic. So there was this argument that if we don't get right, none of us are going to be saved. Beyond himself, but his family members or anyone else, that if they don't do something to corrupt or to end the corruption that they saw around them, they may not get judged fairly. And then it's done. Okay? So maybe he had to take some chances here. It'd be an interesting conversation now. He gets to the pearly gates, he meets St. Peter or whomever, and they're like, yo, tell me about this German peasants' revolt. Like, why did you write that? He had another one that later he became kind of a crotchety old man. He also had one called On the Jews and Their Lies. It's like one of the last things that Martin Luther wrote, where he sounds like everybody's bigoted uncle that sits, at the Thanksgiving dinner or whatever. He kind of sounded like that when he got a little bit older. So, anyway. Okay. Let me hit stop.